Is China actually a threat to the United States? Whenever this topic comes up, I will often hear people talk about, like, Nick, China has a 1 million-man army. Okay, and if I was Malaysia, I'd be really concerned about that. But the United States has dealt with militaries that have far more personnel than we do, and we've wiped them out in a relatively short period of time. It usually takes the United States absolutely zero time to achieve complete air superiority, if not air dominance, naval superiority, and on the ground superiority. So I'm not as interested in what the Chinese claim they can do with their conventional forces. But that doesn't mean they're not a threat. And in fact, in some of the ways that they're the greatest threat to this country is one that we're not only not prepared for, but have actually helped them achieve. Today, I'm having a very important discussion with 3 members who are cybersecurity and telecommunications experts. 2 of them can reveal their identity. 1 of them cannot. But we're going to be asking the important questions about what are the specific threats that China poses the United States, and how could it impact not only our national security, but also our economic dominance. All of that coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. Let's face it, you need more red meat. That's right. We all need more red meat. And not only that, but you need more red meat wrapped in bacon. And it's a good thing that Good Ranchers has got you covered. That's right. You can go to goodranchers.com and use my special code Nick to order your subscription of the best American raised. I don't mean feedlot in Guadalajara and then shipped to America. I mean American raised beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood. That's right. You can all get it delivered to your door in the subscription of your choice. Plus, if you do use my code Nick, not only are you going to get $40 off your entire order, you'll also get the option of free meat with your subscription. That's right. I eat Good Ranchers almost daily at this point. And I'm going to tell you right now, they have spoiled me on every other meat selection. So if you're someone that doesn't want your meat raised in some random place around the world, filled up with additives and then brought to you, if you want the real, genuine article, goodranchers.com, use my code Nick, sign up for one of those subscriptions. I promise you, you are not going to regret it. Well, thank you very much for being with us today. If we could just kind of go down the table, starting with you, John, and maybe just get a quick introduction for everybody, and then we'll jump right into this. Thank you, Jen. You've done some appearances on Tucker Carlson as well, right? Talking about this subject.
Done this a couple times. He's always a character to spend time with, and he's not he's not really big on technology, as you may know. You'd see him riding his bike around Washington. It wasn't for exercise. I think he did not own a car, is what he told me. So I've had fun doing this on a lot of different platforms.
Well, good. You're going to be able to dumb this down for this Green Beret non-commissioned officer. Michelle.
Yep, I'm Michelle Iverson, and I am retired Army as well, and also spent more than 20 years as a DoD an IC civilian, working telecommunications and cybersecurity. With the last 7 years, really focused on information communications technology supply chain, which is really what we're going to dive into a little bit today.
Right, and IC, just for anybody that doesn't know, is the intelligence community. And then our third guest, whose identity we are protecting and is going to go by the name of Sam for this particular conversation. I want to say real quickly, I first met Sam where he came up to me and he said, "Hey, you're in government. We've got some problems." And tried to actually address some of those issues on the state level. And I ended up finding out just how difficult it was to do that because of how many entrenched interests there are involved in this particular issue. So, Sam, can you tell us what you can tell us about your expertise?
My name is Sam. I am a cybersecurity researcher. I have worked in the offensive cyberspace for the government, and on the other side, I also work in defensive cyber operations. But that is all I can share with you guys. When we get into more of the history and the story and how we got here, that will divulge later in this interview.
And that's one thing, too, for the audience to understand. Being able to operate in offensive cyber operations is something you either do for the government or a criminal network, because it's not like anybody's just allowed to engage in offensive cyber operations, but it is one of the best ways to truly understand what the nature of the threat is. So I think we have a panel here that has a wealth of experience, both from the government side, from the defense side, and also from the commercial side. And I think that's really the only way you really get a comprehensive understanding of just what is happening right now and potentially how we address it, hopefully with as minimal interference to our own economic and telecommunications industry as possible. So whoever would like to start, can you give us a little bit of the, right up front, how much trouble are we actually in?
Well, so I'll start off just by saying, when we look at our critical infrastructure, and one of the things I used to say when I was government and would go out and talk to folks is telecommunications is the critical infrastructure that all others rely on. You need it for power, you need it for water and utilities. And we have issues really with where our telecommunications products come from, how they're integrated here in the US. You have China Telecom is integrated at every single data center here in the US at the major data centers. And so while there's supposed to be separation, when you really understand how telecommunications work in the peering network, so when traffic is rerouted, whether that's going to go over Chinese network, they did lose their ability to transport telecommunications outside the U.S. because several years ago they got caught rerouting all U.S. traffic back to China and then back to the U.S. So the FCC pulled their license.
Well, how long was that going on?
Do you know how long it was going on?
It was going on for years. That the volume of activity on the China Unicom and China Mobile networks didn't make any sense for what they needed to be, and that's when they figured out what was really happening with it.
So let me understand this real quick. So what you're saying is that when you look at all of the data centers and routing a significant amount, I'm assuming not all U.S. traffic, but we'll say vast majority?
A good majority. Before the FCC changed their license, they were routing a good portion of the U.S. network through China and then back to the U.S.
Now, when we think of that, is that me making my call to my wife is literally going through a data center and getting rerouted? I mean, again, explain it to a complete novice on this. My conversation with my wife is getting rerouted through China.
It absolutely could, as well as any of your internet data connections, all of it being routed. Which, of course, if I understand your audience isn't always technical, but it's very easy to siphon off that data. And then whether it's encrypted or not, you can do things on the back end to be able to decrypt it and actually have all of that data.
Now, let me ask you a question about the encryption, because that's another thing where people automatically say, well, no, I'm good. It's encrypted. So now that we've established that can we say years? Can we say decades?
Definitely years.
At least years, probably decades.
Okay,
yes.
At least years, probably decades. A significant amount of your traffic on your internet, with your company. It maybe is it the same thing with the U.S. government too? The government employees, is it different based off of the security level you work at?
Most government telecommunications traffic passes over public networks.
Okay, so unless let's say you assume you're working in a secure facility with high level government approved encryption, even if you're working at the State Department on what we would call the green side not secret, that was all getting rerouted through China. Okay. So that's all getting rerouted through China, but it's encrypted. What does that actually mean for most people?
I'll tell you the concern there. When I just started writing Wireless Wars, I met an FBI counter intel officer, and he said, "Where is Huawei deploying its cellular gear in the United States?" I said, well, nowhere, like Montana, North Dakota. That's the only places that'll put it in small mom and pop phone companies. He said, what's out there in Montana, North Dakota? I said, nice trees, good fly fishing. He said, all of our nuclear missile bases are served by Huawei cellular gear.
Wait a second. All right, so Huawei, Chinese-owned company, which means owned by the CCP ultimately, was strategically putting their telecommunications software into Montana because that's where our nuclear forces were routing their stuff through.
All special operations commands also, the Groton sub base, anything that mattered Coincidentally, those are the places that Huawei salespeople showed up and said, Nokia wants $90,000 for this tower. We'll do it for $5,000. We'll do it for $10,000. And we'll have a team here all the time keeping an eye on it for you. Don't worry about it.
So they were doing the Temu version of telecommunications in order to get the contract.
Exactly. They were practically giving it away. And people asked me, well, could they actually listen to the conversations that were happening on the base? And the answer is maybe not. But what they definitely could do, because it's in their contract, is managing and monitoring the network, which means if some special operations colonel shows up at that Malmstrom Air Force Base and he's on his phone, even if he's not on it, if he has it with him, that tower knows he's there. It says that's who it is. That's the SIM card in his phone, the serial number of his mobile phone. We know who he's talking to. We know whether it's text or video or voice. We know how often he's talking. And so you create something called metadata analysis, and that's what the intelligence community works on. They don't even need to know what they're saying. If he's talking to the Strategic Bombing Command, they don't need to know what he's talking about because they know they can pretty much infer that part. But they're saying that's unusual, he's there, and he just visited 3 other bases. Something's going on.
Well, and this is an important thing I want people to understand too, because the work I did toward the end of my career in the military, and again, it was on a tactical level, right? Special Forces Intel Sergeant. But the big part that we did is when we were tracking down high-value targets, it's the same thing. It's not as if we could listen into all their phone conversations, but if I could track that a certain individual was contacting a certain person, and enough of those contacts took place, and then I can look at the timelines and the locations and where it was going on, we started to build a network around that. And then when it came time to actually conducting military operations, we would start to analyze, okay, who in the network should we take out and how does it degrade the network? And should we take this person out or should we do something else? Should we try to turn this person into a source? Should we just gather data on what they're doing? Like what? So to your point, I want people to understand that what this means is even if they're not listening to the direct conversation, somewhere there is a link chart where they are building all of this out. And in this case, it's almost like automated into the process. Like when these conversations take place, when they move, all of it is just automatically collected.
Yeah, well, with AI, you don't need 100,000 people listening to every phone call. They're all being scanned.
They don't need somebody like me reading through 20 reports trying to track it all together.
It's very easily done through automation now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Sorry,
I was actually going to say, kind of along those lines, and just, with the 5G and the wireless technology, the way it's going, and how at risk are we? You've got to tell the story about the camera in the cornfield.
Oh, sure. So, you write a book and people come out of the woodwork and reach out to you. Some of them are cranks. Some of them are really knowledgeable. And I got a contact saying, you got to look at this guy who's got webcams on his cell towers. And some people put up a cell tower and then they rent the space to AT&T and Sprint and so on. And so I found it, and I was able just through Google Maps to find the specific cell tower. And he was talking about how, does anyone know how I can monetize my camera for traffic or weather? Now, the location was labeled as unirrigated cornfield, Nebraska. So there's not a whole lot of interest, people willing to pay $20 a month to see what's happening on that camera. And he was streaming it live. So I zoomed out on Google Maps, and I said, there's an Olive Garden, big deal. I zoomed out again, and there's Offutt Air Force Base. There's the entrance, the highway leading up to it. And I looked at the camera he had, which he described. This is perhaps a useful idiot. It's a Dahua. This is a $4,000 facial recognition, night vision, license plate reading, AI integrated camera with windshield wipers for if it rains, and pan and zoom. 40 times optical zoom. And I said, who spends thousands of dollars and by the way, trying to pursue this and get people to do something about it? The base said, thanks for telling us. My jurisdiction ends at the fence. The federal government, law enforcement, said, this is an American citizen with a legal camera on his own property pointing at a public space. Where's the perp walk? That's what they asked me in federal law enforcement. And I don't knock them because they're right. In America, they can't bang on someone's door and say, we don't like what you're doing. It's not illegal, but stop. They can't do it.
Well, but here's what I don't understand. If this is me, right, and I'm let's say I'm innocent, like you said, this is not some guy that's like secretly working for the Chinese communists. He just wanted to sell some space on a thing. And look, if you're a farmer, you're trying to make money any way you can, right? If the FBI shows up to your door and said, hey, look, I think this camera might be used as a part of an espionage operation or an intelligence gathering operation by the Chinese communists. Would you mind if we got some information on it? I'm willing to bet that your average corn farmer in Nebraska is probably a fairly patriotic dude, and they're going to work with you on that. So, and again, I guess we can't say for certain the FBI didn't follow up and do something, but at least the initial reaction was, well, if we're not going to convict somebody for something, it's really not our problem.
Yeah, no laws being broken.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, not that they know of.
To piggyback on John, just the cell towers in general alone, when you have the cell towers and you own it, you can actually see all the cell phones in the area, and they collect that, which is the SIM cards called IMEI, the IMZs, which is the cell phone serial numbers. So what you do is now you can see these individuals going around the world, the people they talk to, the business relations they develop, and who their importance to and with. So basically developing out the link analysis like you shared. This is also opens up to targeting vectors as well. Recently I grabbed my...
Well, so wait, can I say something real quick? Okay, so I'm not some high level government bureaucrat or anything, but what you're saying is that every time I go down to Richmond for the legislative session, that theoretically, especially the way this worked before the FCC at least, stopped the process of all this being rerouted through China, they would know, they could, like, literally AI could help them gather all of that data just from my cell phone pinging off a tower, and they know exactly when I'm in the governor's office, whose office I went to next, who, my next meeting with my next person based off of, again, all the cell phones coming in. So they could literally instantaneously through AI draw a complete link chart based off of who I was talking with, discussing when I'm carrying legislation in the Virginia House of Delegates in order to try to relegate data centers.
Correct. Well, with using your GPS on your phone, you'll see where exactly you've been walking around. In the past, it was plus minus 5 meters. Now it's more accurate to like 1 meter or less. It's insane. You can also see what people you interacted with and everything. And we have in our country a lot of identity theft, right? But you look at that, we're Social Security recent breach. Now, if you use your phone number for all your things, which is really your Social Security number and the way how it is, since you got it since, however, I mean, your phone number is about 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, or even 80 years. If you're, Doge, you might find 150 years, just to make a joke. But anyways, you can corroborate those sources and information and say this phone number belongs to this person based on the items that we see that's been compromised with all this data. So you take all these data sets and you put it together. You can see and identify the individual, what they do for a living, where they hang out, and then you have predetermined targeting, and then you make it very less sophisticated and build out your learning machine modules to go after individuals.
Well, and I think it's important for people to understand as well that because they look at this like, okay, yeah, but everybody's got this. What's the big deal? Everyone's got their TikTok account, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's not a big deal until it is, right? It's not a big deal until they decide. Again, the guys that I was tracking in Iraq, might not have known. It didn't impact their daily lives at all. I wasn't trying to alert them to the fact that I actually had all this information on them. By the time I used it, it was too late. And so that's kind of the point here as well, right? And I think it's also where you see the average citizen looks at this as like, okay, what's the big deal for me? Well, one, if someone's able to strategically target, high functioning assets within your government, that's a problem. But then it's also something where I don't think people understand that, again, a lot of times when I looked at a network that I was trying to take down, they automatically assume the person at the top of the network is the most valuable. Not necessarily. It depends entirely on what I want to do with that network. So, all right. So all this information was getting routed through. We've got the Chinese telecom setting themselves up strategically in locations where they're not drawing a lot of attention. One of the obvious questions that's going to come up here is, okay, so the FCC recognized that there was a problem. So they shut down this thing where they're routing it all through China. What did that actually solve?
Well, I guess our data isn't going straight to China.
That's good. So
that's one.
We've made it slightly more difficult.
Slightly more difficult. And I will say, since then, we've had some really great laws that are starting to move the needle, but it's really slow. So during the first Trump administration, they issued Executive Order 13871 that said don't buy your telecommunications equipment, your information communications equipment from countries of concern. And then they had Commerce name those countries, and it's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela.
I know this executive order because it's what I modeled my bill in Virginia off of.
Yes.
And yeah.
But implementation is slow. But BIS in 2024, which is a commerce group in Department of Congress, they've stood up a group that is now solely focused on how to address some of that requirement of not buying telecommunications. But, you know, the interagency of the federal government does take time. Congress enacted the Secure Technology Act in 2018 and have done a couple of updates to strengthen it, and that created the Federal Acquisition Security Council. Mm-hmm. So again, though, there's so much special interest, as we talked about, that are pulling at pushing back and saying, oh, you know, every time you turn around, there's another legal thing that you have to address before you can block. You know, and another example, you know, if we're buying network management software that's coded in Russia, that, you know, maybe we shouldn't use that on government networks, right? Like, you can't make up some of this stuff, right? And so, so the laws are helping, and we're getting policies and procedures, but it's fairly slow. Yeah. So, you know, to truly have impact, I think we need bigger, bolder steps, and people who are willing to take the uncomfortable risks sometimes to make a point and move on it.
So here's the question, and this goes back into trying to steel man the argument, right? Because it would be very easy to caricature this as, oh, you know, these politicians just don't care, or everyone's greedy. But you worked in the commercial side of telecommunications, and like there's a very real profit and loss is a real thing. And Americans can say all day long, I can't believe you're doing this. Okay, but what do you choose to buy when you go to the store? And if you're choosing to buy the thing that's 20% cheaper, and there's implications associated with that, well, then businesses are gauging their reaction based off of consumer demand. So how does that get dealt with? Here's one of the problems with that. When I meet with people on the Hill, they say things like, we got to get American companies to do the right thing. At a loss and go out of business, because that would be the right thing.
Don't buy Huawei.
You're just greedy. Like, yeah,
it's $4,000 for the Huawei tower. They should be paying $90,000 to Nokia for the Nokia tower, even if Nokia doesn't return the call in the middle of North Dakota because they don't want to do 5 towers in North Dakota. So here's the consequence. People at this table have worked in government to know that identifying a problem isn't the same thing as solving it. So FCC testified to the Senate nearly 10 years ago that Huawei had deployed around all of our sensitive missile bases and special operations commands. I wrote the book and detailed the problem, a little more implications brought out on that. And Congress leapt into action, very quickly passed the rip and replace program, billions of dollars, billions to tear out the gear at these cell sites and put in trusted equipment. So now about 5 years later, it's only about 90% Huawei. Today, all of our nuke bases are still Huawei, just about all of them. Malmstrom's been replaced. And the reason is the people on the Hill said, we don't want these companies upgrading their equipment on Uncle Sam's dime. So you tear out that old 3G or 4G gear, you can only put in brand new 3G or 4G gear. And the companies were saying, you can't even buy 3G gear or 4G really. The companies like Ericsson, Nokia are only selling 5th generation sophisticated modern telecom. And the bases are saying, we don't want 4G. It's not secure. 5G is more secure. And so they're handcuffed and they literally haven't moved. So the money's still sitting there.
So let me ask a question on that. And look, I'm very familiar with that because even at the state level, you run into these issues, right? There's always second and third order effects to everything that you do. And it becomes a question. Well, not only that, but then you have interest groups that are coming in and all of a sudden, no. When you tear down the equipment and you put the new equipment in, it has to be union labor, right? Like it's always, somebody's always sitting at the table wanting a cut. Were there similar issues with this where it wasn't as simple as just allowing it wasn't as simple as addressing legitimate concerns with respect to, well, if we're going to replace equipment, we don't want to have to replace it again in 4 years, or we don't want to get taken advantage of by a company? Or was it just something where it's like it's just the typical stupidity of government?
There's classic business stuff like Ericsson. Literally, they don't want to send a sales team and an installation team to Montana to put in 4 towers. They'd rather be in San Francisco putting in 170.
Yeah.
And so they may not be pitching the business to these local mom and pop carriers because there's really no money in it. So does the government compel Nokia to send a team out to Metairie, Louisiana, and say, this is what we want you to sell to them? It's hard.
But I think that's where we find the opportunity, right? And especially with the new administration who wants America first. And how do we incentivize the small businesses, mom and pop, that are not the guy from the cornfield, but that truly does care about the nation and wants to go do the towers in Grand Forks or wherever that might be. So I think there's opportunity there, but we need those incentives. And how do you help those small businesses get started? That's where the grants should go, to truly make, especially in telecommunications, because again, every other critical infrastructure relies on it. And it's so insidious if the adversary is building your telecommunications, they already own you, right? Yeah. There's not really recovery from that.
We used to, I used to have people like, oh, the Chinese could hack us. I'm like, what do you mean? We're already hacked. What do you mean going to? Like they're already fully integrated into what we're doing. Now, I will say from a government perspective, that becomes difficult too, because then it's a question of which companies are going to come in and buy up the little smaller companies or operate through 501c3s or NGOs in order to get the grants. And now you have, we just saw this with Doge, right? Where all of a sudden a grant is allocated to do one thing and we find out they're doing something very, very different with it. And, so let me ask you, like, I am typically a guy, I know tariffs are a big conversation right now. And I'm a very free market guy. Like I recognize tariffs as you're just taxing a foreign product, and that additional cost gets passed on to me. That doesn't mean I never see a position for tariffs. And one of the areas where I've said no, tariffs make sense is when you're talking about adversaries. And so obviously it's like, do you see this as a place? Because again, one side of the problem is okay, we have an adversary government that's coming in. And again, they're not even hiding the ball, right? It's not like Huawei bought up a bunch of like little local companies and did a couple of carve outs through, Canada or whatever. And now they're doing that. They just said, hey, here we are. And we're going to undercut the competition because obviously they're getting subsidized by the CCP. So you're creating a non-competitive environment or an uncompetitive environment between your companies that are legitimately doing this versus countries that are doing, or companies that are doing this for alternative motives. Is there a way to effectively prevent them from competing, like as a first step? And then we can argue about, okay, what's the best way to be able to get needed telecommunications out to a particular area?
You can try to prevent dangerous Chinese supplier from competing. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it doesn't work very well at all. I mean, Huawei can't sell its gear in the U.S., but when they spun off their handset company, they can.
Yeah.
And there's companies in the country right now, and I want to be careful because there's some legal implications, but there's companies that if you look at it, they're providing networks in the U.S. Their factories are former Huawei factories. Their managers are former Huawei managers. Their IP is former Huawei IP. So in other words, they just put another name on it. Yep.
Well, and this is something too where I think people need to understand that it gets a little bit more complex because everyone sits back and goes, well, why don't you just ban them? Like, okay, and now there's a new company that came up that started, it's still same management, same everything. It is not as easy as just saying, you're not allowed to do this, right? Because there's a thousand different mechanisms that you can utilize. And unless you want to live in North Korea where we can just shut everything down, it's not going to be as easy as it looks. So we've talked about kind of the cell towers, some of the things set up in Montana and whatnot. Another issue that I know that I've been very concerned about, and we mentioned it briefly, is the data centers piece. And in Virginia right now is home to, I think we're either the top state or close to it with respect to rapidly expanding our data centers within the Commonwealth. And right now, a lot of it is up in Prince William County, Loudoun County, and Northern Virginia areas, but it's coming down this area. And so we've had a lot of regulations around this. But what's interesting is that, to my knowledge, I was the only one that carried any legislation where the concerns were security oriented. Everything else was based around energy consumption, water consumption, and some of those issues are being dealt with, but they're still very relevant. People feel that impact immediately. But the security concern's a little bit more nuanced. And I was surprised to see I didn't create legislation out of nowhere. I took what had been an existing executive order that seemed to have some degree of bipartisan support, and I'm trying to carry that as legislation, and it still can't get passed. How big an issue are the data centers right now?
So I know Sam and I can talk about this a little bit, but I think it's a huge issue for two reasons. One, again, because China Telecom, who can't route traffic outside the U.S., but they can still do data storage here in the U.S. because of the way our laws are. So that's why they're co-located at every major data center.
So every major data center has China Telecom co-located with it doing data storage.
You can go to China Telecom's website and they have an interactive map and you can look at every one, and it's usually co-located with a major US data center.
So wait a second. I appreciate that we passed necessary regulations to keep China from routing all of our information all the way to China and then back here. But we didn't stop them from collecting, storing it, and having access to it. They just got to do it domestically now.
Yeah.
Not only in the United States, but outside the United States, in U.S. data centers outside the United States as well. So it's OCONUS and CONUS. So their infrastructure is very tied into everything we do in with anything to do with U.S. data centers. So they're the biggest Trojan horse, I would say, at this point.
Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so if you think about it, CONUS and OCONUS, and I'll come back to OCONUS, but within CONUS, we can say, okay, I want to keep my data here and I'm going to use AT&T and Verizon as my telecom out, and it should never fail over to a China Telecom. But I worry about the co-location. If you watch any spy movies, the close access that they can get in, and then of course anything that you can siphon off electronically.
Well, that was an issue that I know we were trying to address in the legislation as well. It was this point where, it's just storage. Is it capable of receiving or sending a signal? Yes. Okay, well then there's always the possibility of that being tapped into.
And then you also have the software, because people are putting all of their data in the data center, and then you have software, different companies that will allow you to, one, you've got Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, which are the carriers that have been compromised by China and probably others. And then you have some of the content management capabilities that are in front of those data centers. So you have to look at the supply chain of the hardware, of the software, and you have to go second and third order. And that's really where it comes in for OCONUS, because we have these data centers and they want to have things redundant for redundancy. Maybe they have something in Taiwan or something in Europe, and then their second or first or second tier supplier ends up being in China. So they're outsourcing to China.
Yeah.
So you end up with second, kind of this layered path back to China again. And you can talk about that a little more.
Yeah. Just looking at it, I'm just going to break it down. So there's hardware, which is the infrastructure, a physical device that you, like a server, a phone, a computer. Then there's the software, which could be the firmware for the hardware to tell it how it functions. But not only that, the recent emerging AI technology from China, like DeepSeek. Well, DeepSeek is being held on U.S. data centers. So when you look at AI, well, if DeepSeek can make malware on a whim right now, one of my friends own a cybersecurity company and developed anti-malware software, built entire infrastructure hash-based malware data from DeepSeek alone, and just running different data models from DeepSeek, seeing what kind of malware it can create, and then he ingests that data into his antivirus company. But you look at it, you basically now have entered fifth generation warfare. It's irregular warfare. cyber network exploitation. So if this DeepSeek is on U.S. data centers, well, what will stop them from developing botnets in those data centers and developing logic bombs on those data centers? I mean, I don't know what's going on. No one knows what's going on unless you're the first here in the data centers and actually looking in and breaking down those servers. And there actually is code that's saying, hey, we will shut down your network like with a press of a button. But we don't have the source codes. Who has it? China. So we need to investigate those things. Why we even have TikTok? We understand what TikTok was doing, and then now we have DeepSeek, which can make malware. What are we going to do about it? That's what most people need to start asking the question.
So when you say DeepSeek can make malware, what you're saying is that instead of the good old days where you had to get a bunch of smart people together in a room in order to make this stuff, now you basically type in a prompt to AI and it makes it?
Yes, it's very evil.
Okay. Let me ask this, because again, it is hard to hear all of this and think it's hard to hear all of this and think that it's not a result of either blatant incompetence or blatant incompetence, treason, or perhaps just horrible ignorance. And so what I'd like to do real quick, just to kind of set this up, because what I really want to talk about is what are their actual capabilities right now. But before we get there, I think there has to be some explanation of the audience of how the hell did we let this happen. And my understanding is that when a lot of this, the internet is relatively new, and when the United States, we're an open society, right? So we're very, very happy about making sure that people have access to information, being able to get it to them, and we do it in a competitive marketplace. Can you give me like perhaps the potentially non-nefarious explanation for why this happened the way it did?
I'll take the first crack at this.
Yeah.
And I'll use the word complacency or maybe confusion about the issue. When you hear people say China is a strategic competitor, I don't think Patton ever referred to Rommel as his strategic competitor.
Yeah.
The reason I called my book Wireless Wars is because it wasn't wireless competition. It wasn't Huawei trying to take market share from Lucent Bell Labs. It's a war by other means, and not like a battle between Coke and Pepsi. That's not a battle. That's business. People think this is business we're dealing with, and it's not business. It's war by other means. So when they come in there, they say, "Well, put tariffs on and make their products less competitive." Well, the tariff against China should be 1,000%. Because they're not selling it to make money. It doesn't make any sense. Huawei, $130 billion company, doesn't make sense as a business unless they're a means to a geopolitical end. And the way I describe it is when they took out Bell Labs, which is effectively gone now, the company that invented radar, sonar, the transistor, lasers, all came out of one company, private company, Bell Labs, by subsidizing Huawei to undercut them until they went out of business. For less than the cost of an aircraft carrier, China destroyed the #1 innovator in the free world. It was $10 billion or so in subsidies. They didn't do it for business. What's our financial return on an aircraft carrier? There isn't a financial return. It's just a mission. And that's what these companies from China are doing. They're on a mission. They're not trying to make money. Nice if they can, but that's not their job.
Okay. No, that's an important paradigm shift that people need to understand, is that you're not competing with a Chinese company. It would be the equivalent of us going to, a hostile nation and saying, or going to Japan and being like, we're going to make it really expensive for you to bomb Pearl Harbor, right? Like we're going to make it so anti-competitive that you're really going to think twice about bombing Pearl Harbor. It's like, well, if the objective is to take out the Pacific Fleet, okay, you might be charging them more to do it, but you're not stopping it. You're just changing the dynamic with respect to how much it costs, because you treat it like a competitive environment, whereas they treat it like warfare.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So basically what this really comes down to, and again, the other thing too that I think is important to understand is when we start to see the internet emerge and we start to see it become more, widespread in the 90s to where the average person now has it on their desktop computer. China just started to emerge as an economic, powerhouse. Before that, I mean, you go back to the 70s and China was having difficulty feeding its population. A very, very rapid ascent as soon as they get most favored nation, trading status and things like that. And so it's not, I guess, to some degree, I'm old enough to remember when the great threat, when I was younger, was the Soviet Union. And then it was the Japanese are going to buy everything in America. And it was only, after the, early 90s where you start to see the economic downturn with Japan, that China starts to emerge at the same time. And now we're starting to recognize that as a potential threat, but it's still, nowhere near. It wasn't the world's second largest economy. So I guess I could understand why with that international paradigm, people just they considered this a way to get cheap products. And to be able to expand access to the market, and again, you had U.S. companies going, well, gosh, if this company's going to charge me this much and this company's going to charge me this much, I'm not actually doing my fiduciary duty to my investors, and I'm not effectively taking care of my customers by choosing the significantly more expensive product. And you can even argue this in economic terms, because I've had these discussions before with people where they talk about, well, that other country's subsidizing their own industry. Okay, but what that essentially means is the taxpayers in that country are paying more money to give me cheaper products. Cool. If it's a competitive environment instead of a hostile environment. And those are two very different things. And so so basically what I'm hearing is 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s as we're ramping all of this up, and we're looking at this as an economically competitive space. They're looking at it as the means to set up what they would need to contend with the United States in the future.
100%.
Okay.
Let me just share with this is how did the Chinese...
One more thing. The reason why I think that's so important is because nothing is easier than just saying, nope, it was a bunch of evil, stupid traitors. Because if you chalk everything up to evil, stupid treachery, you don't actually identify what the real problems were that led us to that point, and you're not going to be able to effectively identify it in the future. And so recognizing that it looks like what we really had here was legitimate concerns about being able to expand the marketplace, expand the internet to everybody, which is something that everybody was down for. But we did it in a way with a hostile foreign government.
Just specific to that, I think, again, with good intention, people thought, oh, if you open up China to the free market, they'll become more like us, not really thinking behind the Communist Party's end goals. Yes. And so we're a bit naive in that regard.
Yeah, I just want to just focus on history really fast. In the 1950s, we said Taiwan is not part of the Chinese country at all, and it's their own country. Then you look at the Korean War and the Vietnam War. You see Chinese soldiers killing Americans at one point, and then all of a sudden we've forgotten all that, and those generals in the Vietnam War are still alive today. Or sorry, they're not generals back then in the Vietnam War, but they were soldiers who are now generals in the CCP military, who knows what it's like to kill Americans, are in charge in the military, in the Chinese military. So if you think about that, it's like, okay, well, there's intent back there, and they've been doing a long game. Well,
but let me push back a little bit. The same people that were old enough to remember when the Soviets and the U.S. were on the same side in World War II, or when we were fighting the Germans, and then 5 years later, the West Germans are on our side against the Soviets, or the same thing with the Japanese. We nuked Japan, and then a decade later, they're one of our stronger allies in the region. So this has been kind of the normal course of human history, where realpolitik changes and foreign enemies are now suddenly allies. And again, the whole point of Nixon opening up China was the bigger threat at the time was the Soviet Union, and this represented a huge opportunity to be able to separate 1 billion communists, right? Or not at that time 1 billion, but you know what I mean, from the Soviet sphere of influence. And even though we had very, very different values, and I think Mao Zedong was one of the most evil men in history, at that point there was a different existential threat. But to your point, and I think the point Michelle was making as well, it's to say that, okay, but we lack an understanding of Chinese culture and how Chinese culture is integrated with communism and Maoism And even though we thought, oh, well, we're becoming friends now because look, the Soviets are a mutual enemy. And then by opening up trade, we're going, because this is the joke used to be that no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with one another. But the difference is it appears that we were dealing with a culture that had a very, very different understanding and a much more long game view of history than we did.
Right. So let's talk about indicators, right? So in the early 90s to current day, there were a lot of times where it's reported that the children's toys will have lead in it that's made in China. Well, that's wild to see the historical timeline of that been happening throughout, the last 20, 30 years of lead in food, lead on children's toys, products made by China that are doing things that are nefarious, not productive in building a relationship. So you look at the actions of the Chinese, it's not blessing us, it's hurting us. So if you based on the person's character, they're not to be trusted. We had many indicators, but I think the public turned a blind eye for business because it's very affordable. Well, we're a capitalistic society, so we want to make money. So when China created state-owned enterprises, basically backed businesses in the United States, it flourished, and we have now. You just look at it. Look at a tariff list. Let's go with tariff list. That's current day. It's all American companies in China. Everything you touch, a computer, a laptop, a keyboard, your mouse, anything you touch, it says made in China. And you look at it from a technology standpoint and talk about a cyber war. Well, they basically made everything, and they're the Trojan horse. We have everything. They created everything. So basically, everything's a Trojan horse. You don't know what's in there. We don't know if that firmware they put on those devices are beaconing out to China. Well, actually, we do. We have many, many reports that they were beaconing out to China. There have been many times that firmware had malware on them being installed into the computer with a next patch. So we had a lot of indicators, but we did nothing. And I don't know what to do with that information besides we did nothing.
Well, okay, let me ask you this. To avoid the appearance of hyperbole, do we really do nothing?
We do more than nothing, but I think we haven't gotten the scale that we need yet.
So it's not that we're doing nothing, but we're doing nothing, nowhere sufficient.
We keep patching, we keep doing the same thing over and over. It's like, it's insanity at this point. You keep doing the same things over and over and over, and you're still allowing the same, we buy the product from China, the firmware's coming from China, but you know what, we'll just get a new patch to fix this, or we do cybersecurity over and over.
Okay, but okay, so here's where I'm gonna ask this, because the other thing, because whenever we say it's insanity, I usually always say almost every single decision has a rational explanation if you understand the conditions in which it's made. And it could be a bad decision, but it's usually not pure insanity. So what's the reason?
Let me make one kind of thought on that.
Yeah.
1980, and you've pointed this out on your show, China's GDP, their economic output per capita was around $290, which was worse than Sudan.
Yeah.
Worse than Sudan was in 1980. America's was around 11,000. Today, China's around 11,000 per capita, give or take, and America's around 80,000, give or take. A lot of the wealth that this country has created in these 40 years is due to the China contributions. They made cheap stuff that let us incorporate into our products and sell them. They made us wealthier than we would have been without China. In a liberal worldview, where everyone's in this together, we're all just trying to get rich, this is a great outcome. Japan, Germany, all these countries that supplied us and bought from us were doing it to get rich. Japan wasn't trying to make America happy. They were trying to get Japanese people rich.
Yeah.
We thought that's what China was doing. And as Michelle said, if you look at them like they're us, instead of Maoist ideologues, then they're not going to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And yet this was all perfectly aligned with their philosophy, which is world dominance. They're the center, the middle kingdom. They want to rule the earth and extend their hegemony, and they say so.
Yeah.
They told us right up front.
Hiding the ball.
Nope.
Yeah. So, okay. So I think that's a good base of kind of where we're at, how we got there. And again, I appreciate what's the rational explanation for this instead of just assuming, again, everyone's just evil and stupid. But clearly we haven't done enough, right? Clearly we're still failing to properly recognize the threat. So I want to throw out a scenario here. We're already seeing, so we debated this a while back where I think China is in a enormous amount of trouble. We think our inflationary policy is bad. We can get away with it because we're the world's reserve currency. What they've done to their currency is just debilitating. Plus, their housing market is absolutely in the tank, and it represents so much of their economy right now that they are in massive trouble. Plus, you add the pressure of the tariffs. Now, we were all sitting here watching, debating what's China's next move going to be, and the most obvious answer is Taiwan. And I remember looking at going, do you know how difficult it is to invade a country that doesn't want to be invaded when you got to cross 100 miles of open ocean? And yeah, sure, China's got a 1 million man active duty military. That doesn't mean they're all going to be on boats headed to Taiwan. But Taiwan's military inflates to 2.1 million when they activate their reserves. And I've seen a map of Taiwan. It ain't the friendliest place to try to fight through and occupy, especially if you've got to maintain logistics across 100 miles of open ocean, which only offers you really a few months out of the year to be ideal conditions. So when you add all of that together, yes, Taiwan is something they want. It's nowhere near as easy as it looks when you're just checking out Excel spreadsheets. And we just see now, what is China doing? Well, they're getting far more involved in the war in Malaysia, in the civil war in Malaysia. And they're kind of playing both sides of that because they absolutely have to be able to have access to oil through Malaysia, through the pipeline they're running through Malaysia, without having to depend on transporting it through the Malacca Straits. So here's China. Economic problems, birth rate problems, 30 million more men than they have women, which is a recipe for disaster because you have 30 million excess males without the possibility of getting married or having a family. We start to get real militant, right? So they got all these problems going on. Plus, they're tied into everything that's, our telecommunications. They could really do a lot of damage. Now, is that because China will then invade the United? No. Japan wasn't going to. Japan had to take out the Pacific Fleet because if they were going to get down to the Dutch East Indies to be able to have access to oil to do their other operations, they had to make sure that the Pacific Fleet could not interact. And they operated off the assumption that it would take us far more time than it actually did to repair and counterattack, right? China finds themselves in a situation where they're actually dealing with some sort of regional consideration and whatnot, and they have to at least they have to give the United States something to worry about that is far more of a concern than whatever they're doing in a part of the country that, quite frankly, the average American couldn't care less about. What do they do with with their current access and placement? What could they do?
Here in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. There's tons of news articles that you can, the software and many of the cranes, the big cranes in our ports, all Chinese software. The current big, large transformers that run all of our power grids, Chinese, and it takes a 2-year lead time to get replacement parts. Now, there's some great technology in space and other things that maybe can compensate for that. But are we looking at again, back to the supply chain, you either have to have them on hand, but if they can take out our power grids, which is very possible and plausible, can they take out our ports so we're not getting any goods? And if we don't make it here in the U.S. any longer, that puts us even more at risk. And then also when you look at military age men coming across the southern border over the last 4 to 5 years, then that's also a significant threat. And if I don't take it out via software, then I can take it out hardware. I think there were, of course, when you're ex-military, you think everything's a military thing, right? But a couple of years ago, it was like several power companies were shot at and disrupted. And that to me was almost like, wow, is this kind of a probe of seeing what we can do with a shotgun going after well, not a shotgun, but it's a rifle going after.
Well, and people also have this attitude of, we'll just make it a harder target. Like, how much more do you want to pay in your electricity bill? Yeah. Right. How much more do you want to pay in taxes? It's expensive to do these things. That's why they're not done unless there's a significant threat. So, all right. So let me throw out a couple of scenarios here. You guys tell me realistic, not realistic, whatever. Because China is obviously a huge funder of also within our university system, and we see some of the problems that are going on within our university systems right now. We see some of the various, I mean, all of these major protests and riots. None of this is just purely a grassroots, when the pallets of bricks and cinder blocks show up ahead of time and everyone's got the same tents at the die-in at the Columbia University, that ain't by accident. All right. So let's say China's in a situation where they need to take the United States off the table in order to do something. They don't actually need to do rolling. Okay, first of all, do we think it was plausible that they could do rolling blackouts in major American cities?
Yes.
Okay. Do they think it's possible that they could shut down communications for, let's say, more than a week?
Yes.
Is it also capable that they could, along with what they can just do kind of remotely, from like pushing buttons and switching off switch, could they immediately deploy with relative ease enough malware to, prolong these sorts of shutdowns, or let's say engage in like significant issues with the financial markets?
Yes. Can I share more to this statement? There's a thing called KV botnet, which the FBI has been trying to shut down. So this botnet, when it hits a server, which is a router or a switch, it would brick it, meaning it completely render useless, and you have to put a new product in order to.
It's a new hardware.
Yes.
Okay. That's almost kind of like the Stuxnet stuff that we saw in Iran, where it's like we're not just doing this to screw up your software, we're actually melting down your machine.
And with it co-located around the United States and outside the United States with U.S. data centers, that is the biggest concern right now.
Okay. So, all right. So we've already established they could significantly disrupt our financial markets, significantly disrupt our telecommunications, where people can't even pick up the phone and call whatever. Significantly disrupt things around our military communication system. Basically create a situation at the ports where imports are just sitting on the docks, wasting away, not getting delivered anywhere. This obviously would also generate an internal response, not to mention the fact that people would start demanding certain political action and whatnot. So all of this is capable of them doing. And then I was also going to say, they could also pretty much, they could probably activate cells that they already have operating in the United States that could actually engage in hard target hits. Plus they could probably also access and, sympathetic student protest riots and everything else to go along with it at the same time. So they could, with relative ease, push a button, and that just kind of happens without them having to maintain, complex communication networks with these independent cells.
Correct.
Okay. Do you think they could, and now as far as our countermeasures are concerned, are we in a position where, is this something where, wow, this sucks for a week, but we're more or less up and running within 2 to 3 weeks, or are we talking potentially months of dealing with blackouts and malware and?
Well, Michelle mentioned the big electrical components for the grid.
Yeah.
If you took one of them out, and there was a case where one of them was intercepted at the port, I think in Houston, and instead of going to its place in American power grid, it was shipped off to I think Sandia. Never any comment about it, but clearly China, the concern was China had done something. These things can't be stockpiled because they're custom built for where they are in the network.
Yeah.
And if you take one out, it can literally be months or years. If you go crash program, it could be months or years to replace it, which means Colorado Springs doesn't have electricity. And you could kill more people. If they took the East Coast out for 30 days, more people would die than in a nuclear strike. That's experts share those assessments with me, because every hospital, the diesel, they have backup until the diesel runs out in 3 days.
Right. And even if somebody says, oh, we've got solar, many of the solar are smart solar panels with communications gear that also comes from China. The solar panels come from China.
Yeah.
So again, your entire ecosystem is reliant on that supply chain.
Okay. So what this really leads me to is that if I now look, there's also the MAD concept, right? Mutually assured destruction.
That's what it is.
And so obviously the Chinese look at this and it's like, okay, I think most countries have learned throughout the 20th century that pissing us off is generally a bad idea up to a certain point. So it sounds to me like what happens here is if Xi Jinping needs the United States to just not be interested in what they're doing in a particular part of the world, he doesn't have to do any of this. He just has to, he already knows, we know they can do it. So all they have to do is come up with a mutually agreed upon course of action where the United States doesn't get involved, right? Especially around midterm elections or a presidential election. You just don't care what we're doing in this part of the world today, right? And if you don't care what we're doing in that part of the world today, we don't shut off all the hospitals in New York City. I mean, is that a fair and accurate threat that our own intelligence services would basically, like, the national security advisor sitting down with the president and Xi Jinping goes, okay, Donald Trump, we're putting up your tariffs and whatnot, and we're not doing X, Y, and Z, but you're not going to do this or else this happens. The national security advisor looks over at President Trump and goes, yes, Mr. President, they absolutely can make good on that threat.
Well, so Trump would have certainly preferred not having COVID hit during the economic boom that was going on the first couple years.
Yeah.
And there's no question that if we had 2 more years of boom, I'm sure he expects that he would have been reelected at the time. So to wave a threat like that, like, do you want something bad to happen? Just look the other way here. We're going to do something. And I could see even a fairly steadfast politician saying, well, you can credibly say this isn't our business anyway. Let's not get involved here. Yeah. And I'll do more good for the country as a leader here than if I were to stand up to this thing.
Absolutely. Mr. President, Afghanistan's got $2 trillion worth in rare earth minerals. It's not even in your sphere of influence. You don't want to be here. You, Mr. President, said that it was time to withdraw and get out. We're going to play a little bit more stronger role in this particular area. We just need you to not care. It's part of our Belt and Road Initiative, and we just need you to not care. Oh, by the way, if you do decide to care enough, well, problems are going to start happening at ports.
Right. Maybe it's Pollyannish, but I would like to think we have more integrity. I think it's actually plausible, whether it's...
I've been involved in politics for the last 10 years, I can assure you.
And I haven't, but but I think probably more likely is that it is that just, it's not to the point of mutually assured destruction. They could say, oh, I'm going to do this to you.
Yeah.
But we're going to say, yeah, but I could do this to you as well.
Oh, yeah, we can do more.
So we have capability.
We can do more.
Even the things probably we've talked about today. But I do think it's much more of a subtle, is that they will start disrupting. And we have all of these, whether it's riots or it's riots and rolling brownouts and rolling internet outages that keep us busy enough, I don't know if I think it's that dire, but you've been in politics more. I would like to think that we wouldn't succumb to that.
I would like to say that, well, and again, there's always thresholds, right? So John's description was perfect, right? This is where real politique comes in, right? Where we have our moral standards, and that's absolutely true, but there's also practical limitations on what we can do and what can be involved in, and what are we actually responsible for, and what are the American people willing to do? Because ultimately, I will tell you how elections work. It's a pretty simple mathematical equation. And I have seen a lot of good people compromise on issues I don't think they should, because the response was, Nick, you don't understand. If I don't do this, I'll lose my seat, and I can't do any good if I can't get reelected. And so I'm just letting the voters prioritize what they want to see. The problem is I don't think the voters actually understand the depth and breadth of this concern right now. And how, and again, it's because we still are an overwhelmingly economic and militarily dominant country, not to mention that we're the world's reserve currency, to where people don't feel that as a real threat. And there's every incentive for China to not exercise the full asymmetric capability that they've essentially established because of what our retaliation might look like. The problem is, and we've seen this before, we are a constitutional republic. We have elections we have to contend with. I don't think Xi's worried about the next election. And so this is always one of those things where I don't think it makes them stronger. It's just a different consideration to take into place, to where he can keep his regime in place while suffering short-term setbacks if he believes, even incorrectly, that there's long-term benefits associated with it. And I think we've already established that they're much better at looking at long-term strategy. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's other ways that you can look at it and say, well, no, they certainly haven't with respect to the management of their economy or their population. But they have a much higher threshold for putting their population through really misery. If it means supporting the regime, then the mechanism exists on this place. So this leads me to kind of my final question in all of this. We've established the problem. We've established how it got here. We've established some of the trends and things that took place. I think one of the most insightful components of all of this is not the specifics of how integrated they already are into our telecommunication system, but the improper analysis of viewing them as an economic competitor instead of a hostile threat. By the same token, if you are Congress, if you are Donald Trump, I will tell you right now, serving 10 years in an elected position, first of all, the Americans are tired of war, and for obvious reasons. We've made a lot of mistakes with respect to our foreign policy. I know, I've been a part of some of them, right? On the ground with a rifle. And if you ask people right now in America, what is motivating you to get to the polls? It isn't the threat of China. Right? It's going to be predominantly economic reasons. Some of those economic reasons will be tied to things like immigration. Some will be tied to a lack of manufacturing. So there's overlap in the concerns. But when I look at financially what it would take to undo this mess and then redo it, and the way that the various interest groups would lobby Congress, we're not even talking hundreds of billions. We're talking trillions of dollars of infrastructure costs, of revamping the way we even do these things or think about it. And the reason I say trillions is not because that's what it needs to cost. It's because of what it will cost when all the special interests get into the process of deciding that, well, no, again, my union needs to be the one that handles this integration, and that union, that's just the nature of the politics. When I see one congressman insisting that we do something in his district, not because it's the most effective or efficient way to do it, but because the company in his district that donated to his last campaign is advocating for it. Like, that's all going to factor into this process. So what is the realistic way that we actually effectively address this? Is it just, okay, don't do it anymore and move on from here, and gradually over time, this technology becomes outdated and integrated with other what do you guys see as the real way to address this?
I'm gonna, because I'm gonna go, and then I think Sam should go, and I think we should end on John because I think he's gonna have really insightful things.
Yeah.
I think one is there has to be better awareness of the problem and the situation. Because I think everybody cares about their kids in the future and everything like that. So do they understand the problem and what's at stake? So one, awareness of the problem. Two is you don't turn battleships on a dime. So, and my other, all stupid analogies, right? How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, which we have been. We need to make the right policy and regulation. And I know that's antithetical, like Trump doesn't want more regulation, but I'm talking big things that'll be major muscle movements that will drive, like 13873, which I think was
the executive order.
Yeah, the executive order.
Was a very common sense, like, hey, don't buy your telecom software from an adversarial country.
Right. And so putting a little bit more teeth there. There's technology right now. Companies, PE firms, venture capitalists need to understand to look at the entire supply chain so that they're not making our adversaries, our suppliers, or again, back to cheap labor. And that's where I support tariffs.
Well, the economic argument here too is to say that, look, there's a hidden cost to what you're actually doing.
Right.
Like the obvious cost you see is the price on the piece of software you're buying. The hidden cost associated with it is it's going to be used to shut down your entire data center, and you're not going to be able to do anything. And so in the risk assessment matrix that we use, right, this would be, okay, maybe it's not likely right now, but it's catastrophic if it happened.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's where they say, oh, it's so much cheaper. But yeah, when you're hacked or you got ransomware or something else, they're not factoring that cost in when they're doing their trade analysis.
Got it.
So I think, continue to build off the laws. And I will say props to the federal government at Commerce, at DOD, at ODNI. They really are trying to address it. It's, again, back to the government. There's a lot of bureaucracy in trying to get through some of it. But they're aware. And I think business and people need to be aware of the challenges and understand why we're pushing what we're pushing. And I'll leave it there and let Sam talk, and then back to John.
I say let's I'll go from a perspective of being stewards and knowing who you're working with. So when you're buying as a business, just in general, know your H-1B visas. If you're hiring them, just know that it could be nefarious. Even though you buy from Canada or Mexico, make sure they're not imported Chinese workers and they're employing workers that will have CCP military background and putting things on your stuff before it gets into your infrastructure. I mean, the Chinese espionage program is the best in the world. I mean, look at their military, look at their everyday things. They're very, very, very advanced. They're our first world at this point. They're near pure adversary. So when we, look at universities. Like, don't allow just foreigners just freely get information or advanced technology information or anything along those lines. Just know who you're working with. That's the start. Just to stop the flow of information and technology advancement to a nation state.
Yeah, I agree with that, Sam, and I would add that the main message is I think we need to look at this more on a war footing. Mm-hmm. This isn't business. In business, everyone can win in business. You have the win-win expression that China uses, farcically. They say, oh, this is a win-win deal. They don't understand win-win. True capitalism, that's the basis of it. Both parties come out ahead. In war, it's not win-win. It's who can make the other side lose more. Mm-hmm. You drop a bomb, you just wasted $100,000, but you want them to lose a $12 million tank. So that's lose-lose. That's a war footing, which sounds awful. And the implication is the government at the federal level, from state government, state governments are not going to step up. They don't think about international intrigue. Mm-hmm. The federal level, you need the government saying, companies, you can't source here. You mustn't buy this. You can't sell there. Not when we do tariffs, we should know it's costing us money. We're getting poorer when we do it. That's what happens in war. And so we have to say, times are tough. We've got an enemy out there. It's not a competitor. It's not a strategic rival. It's an enemy. That's how they see us. We didn't want that. We don't want that, but that's the truth. So the government has to start telling companies you can't do these things and help push a decoupling. If we did it today, it would be catastrophic. Neither side can do it. And know that make ourselves less and less dependent. It could take 5 years, could take 20 years. I don't know. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen right away. It's probably closer to 20 years. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, in the meantime, maintain the counterpunch, because the main thing that keeps China out of Taiwan and keeps them from cutting us off on rare earth and other things is what we would do back. As long as they need 65% of their animal feed from the U.S., and they would literally starve in China if we cut off our supplies, they're not going to do things. We have a president who's a tough negotiator. Mm-hmm. That's helpful. You can like him, you can hate him, but he's a negotiator. And so we have to be tough with them and maintain that counterpunch, because that's, I think, the only thing is that mutual assured destruction you talked about. That's why they're not doing what they'd really like to do.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I really appreciate hearing it both from the security perspective and also from the commercial perspective, because anybody that tries to consider one without the other is not being serious. Because again, we can say with all the bravado tomorrow, rip it all out and don't do it anymore and close off everything. It's like, okay, well, tens of millions of Americans now can't get their, can't call mom on the phone, right? Like that's not a realistic scenario. But I would love to see is if there's one thing that I think should be like a primary takeaway from this is we need to start putting China in its proper place with respect to our foreign policy. And it's not most favored trade status. It's not, it is someone that does have adversarial ambitions with the United States and who has quite rightly on their part invested in the asymmetric component of this fight. They don't expect to beat us in a conventional fight. They don't expect to beat us in a nuclear fight. They don't think their fleet's going to take out our fleet. They don't think their Air Force is going to take out our Air Force. But the way that they have invested is the way that they could cripple the United States in the way that makes the most sense with a representative government and regular election cycles. And so I think that component of keeping the offensive capability very, very high while starting very, very slowly to just at least don't make the same mistakes. Sounds like that's part of this as well, right? Like, don't continue to make the mistakes you've already made. Allow for time, allow for investment, and then also, create the necessary opportunities within our own domestic industry to be able to create the things that we need that we've identified as strategic infrastructure. And I think you mentioned something else there about the rare earth minerals that I think is important. Is one of the things that China has been very, very strategic about is going around and getting a lot of times poorer countries addicted to Chinese loans when it comes to building ports, when it comes to building, cobalt refineries in places like the DRC. I'm seeing a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa right now. DRC is actually a perfect example about this. Tessa Katie is begging us to come in and assist. And again, I don't think we want much of the internal problems that are taking place there, but there is something to be said if the United States doesn't take greater control over, and again, through mutual cooperations with allied or friendly nations, with respect to strategic resources, you're going to find yourself at war with the people that do control those resources. So, well, listen, I can't thank you all enough for spending the time, for your expertise, for your advocacy on this. And in some ways, for taking a risk to actually talk about it in the level of detail that we are, because to your point, this is all going to go out on YouTube. And it's going to go through, and it's going to be cycled, and it's going to be watched. And again, with AI, it's not the old days where at least they needed somebody tracking all of this. Now with AI, this all gets put in a link chart, and connections are made and whatnot. But if we're not talking about it, and if the American public aren't at least somewhat aware of what the actual concerns are here, we're never going to be able to effectively address it. So thank you all very much. And thank you all very much for watching. If you found this interesting, please leave us some information in the comments section. Tell us what you think. Give us some ideas on what you think should be done about this. Because again, it is a real concern that we're going to have to address. I think this administration wants to, but one of the things that we have learned over and over and over again is politicians operate in large part, regardless of what their morals are. And I'm not saying they're all immoral jerks. I hope I'm not an immoral jerk, and I've been elected for 10 years. But if you want politicians to address difficult issues, hard issues that are by necessity going to cost us something, then you have to reward them for doing the right thing. And I think we have an administration that is interested in doing so. Let's all signal to them that we will reward them for addressing this hard issue, even when there's a cost associated with it. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.